In this video I will be evaluating the so-called 5 personality patterns that exists under various labels, such as the 5 Reichian character types, the Lowenian system, bioenergetic character, characterology, character defense patterns, character structures, etc. It seems that this system isn't all that famous, since it doesn't have a clear name, which in itself is a bit of a flaw to start off with. It also has a lot of psychoanalytical jargon. It originated with Wilhelm Reich, a star pupil of Sigmund Freud, and later Reich's student Alexander Lowen. Unlike the 5-factor model, this is an actual typology with 5 core energies or human types, although some practitioners will claim that this is just defense patterns and not personality types. And this makes it more similar to my own biopsychology model than the 5-factor model, since my model also talks about human types in terms of core energies. And so I have borrowed some elements from the Lowenian system, but still I must criticize it. After all, I would not go through the hassle of creating my own model if there was already a perfect one out there. If that was the case, then I would just use that one. So in this character model there are 5 core energies and people are a blend of them, but 1 or 2 of the energies tend to dominate in an individual. There seems to be different names for the 5 core energies or patterns, such as unwanted, needy, controller, endurer, and obsessional, or more psychiatrical technical names such as schizoid, oral, psychopath, masochist, and rigid. Recently, someone named Stephen Kessler have attempted to popularize them with the names leaving pattern, merging pattern, aggressive pattern, enduring pattern, and rigid pattern. Looking over various descriptions of these patterns, it appears that the leaving pattern or schizoid correlates mostly with our abstractum and probably the occasional misericordia and fiduciam. The merging or needy pattern mostly correlates with our misericordia and libidinem. The aggressive, psychopathic or controlling pattern mostly correlates with our excitium and magnitudinem. The enduring or masochistic pattern mostly correlates with our corpus. And the rigid or perfectionistic pattern mostly correlates with our meritum and urbanum. It appears that our fiduciam is somewhat overlooked in this typology since there's no clear correlation, though some probably are labeled schizoid. However, it is difficult to tell precisely when they don't provide real-life examples of the types. Sometimes I've read a personality description and I think of one type. Then somebody shows an example and I see that they meant a different type. I will now take a closer look at some of these descriptions and comment on them. I have chosen the descriptions at Energetics Institute. So schizoid or unwanted child leaving pattern would be the closest type for me. And I'm curious why it's nicknamed the unwanted child. The unwanted child essentially perceives or experiences their earliest life from conception till birth and beyond as a hostile reception where they were rejected not just in their own nature and humanity, but for existing at all. The child felt threatened and unsafe and may have wanted to die rather than continue in life. The childhood dynamics that set up a person to have an unwanted child personality outcome are typically those where the environment, which typically is represented by the mother, or what is happening to the mother, turns hostile against the vulnerable and totally dependent fetus or child. Okay, first of all, this did not happen to me. And I see a huge flaw in regarding the origin of a human type as being caused by childhood trauma. Personality disorders and mental illnesses may be caused by childhood trauma, but not core energies or human types. This should be obvious by now. Just because you have traumatic experiences doesn't mean your entire body type alters shape. I mean, yes, I am thin like the schizoid is portrayed to be, but I didn't have this trauma. Also, another thing that makes me a bit critical of the idea of early trauma is that most people can't remember their first years in life. And certainly I don't remember my life before conception. so I am not satisfied with or convinced by this supposed causal mechanism. External pressures translated to the fetus by the placenta in the womb might trigger a specific type, but once the child is born, the type and core energies are already set, regardless of what happens thereafter. And let's say you do everything right in order not to produce one of these patterns, types or core energies. Then what will the person be like? They don't describe a sixth energy that is the result of everything going right in childhood and before conception. I assume we'd still be one of the 5 character types, but we would be healthy. But if that's the case, then an unhealthy environment cannot fundamentally be the cause. I also want to point out that my mother did not exist in an even remotely hostile or unhealthy environment as described here. Because of that, I will ignore the descriptions of the cause of the characters from here on. On the other hand, the point being made that we don't inherit our type from our parents is good and accurate. All the talk about schizoids feeling unwanted, rejected or hated makes me think that the description is a blend of misericordia and abstractum types with similar configurations. But I'll focus on what sounds like abstractum. The typical compensation for the schizoid is to escape either into spirituality, virtual reality, or a narrow vertical form of skill specialization which they master in a rigid perfectionistic way, and within which they can operate safely. Escapism is a form of dissociation, and when done in isolation, it assists in making the person feel safe. Social activities are terrifying for many such individuals. Those are not my motivations for being drawn into things like spirituality and abstract worlds. It's not a defense mechanism, it's more like a natural tendency or craving, if you will. What's said here may be the motivation for many others, especially traumatized people with similar personalities, but the core energy is independent of trauma. Also, I rarely have panic attacks, and neither do most other abstractum individuals. This description is too neurotic. Abstractum is a rather invisible type, so I'm beginning to suspect that psychology doesn't really know all that much about them. As it is, I don't truly recognize myself in the descriptions of these 5 energy types. Another reason why I prefer my own typology. For certain fiduciam individuals, I guess it's an okay description though. Magnitudinum individuals might recognize themselves too, since it says they only trust the truth and are vigilant for when the truth is betrayed, as this proves that trust cannot exist in this place or person. But this sounds like abstractum. They shut down and become deadened in the body, still and peaceful in movement and mind. They adopt spiritual giving as a defense against vigor and energetic release, so reinforcing their blocks. They are not in contact with their impulses, which are repressed and so often are not aware of own hunger, thirst, heat or coldness of the body. But I don't agree that this being a defense is accurate, even if it might be for some. An abstractum who's had a trauma might think and believe they are the way they are as a defense. But this only means that their trauma gets in the way of them perceiving themselves objectively. Since I am a relatively healthy abstractum, I feel I have to speak for my type so that psychologists don't make erroneous assumptions about us. So the big flaw here is that the descriptions describe several different types and lumps them together. I'll do a quick survey of the descriptions of the other types as well. The oral or needy child merging pattern seems to be a mixture of misericordia and libidinum. The needy person will become resentful at being used, but soon forgives and fears being abandoned by pressing their needs and wants onto others. Whenever the needy person gets self-gratification, they feel immense guilt and feel they do not deserve it, and tend to try and sabotage others' genuine attempts to give to their needs. A second form of the needy personality are not adjusted or compensated to disown their own impulses of neediness, and will show and demand the needs quite readily and often. They will be demanding of others, and have endless needs and an inner void that cannot be filled up by whatever they get or consume. They can become obsessive and addictive in this consumption, which never equates to enough because they are trying to fix an inner emotional problem with materialistic out there objects or substances. This needy personality can be addictive to food, drink, smoking, drugs, collecting in some shape or form, or relationships, which may be both medicating or self-soothing their pain and feelings by these externalized strategies and addictions in order to fill an inner emptiness. They are a bottomless pit and often drive away partners who feel suffocated by their neediness and endless demands that never cease. Many needy personalities learn that sickness brings attention, and as adults will unconsciously manifest illness and depression in order to get attention and nurturance. There is a grandiose quality to the needy personality. They make plans and start grand projects which are way beyond their capacity to execute and finish. In these times they take on too much responsibility, overcommit, and start on ventures which soon start to drain them, leading ultimately to a collapse. This often leads into depression and an exposing of their real vulnerable childlike natures. Underneath all this is a deep unconscious belief that it is still someone else's job to take care of them. Shows up in many of our female models who are often the needy personality, and so on. Of course, just like not everything fit me in the schizoid description, it's also likely that they have an incomplete understanding of these needy types and why they appear needy. The psychopath or controller aggressive pattern seems to be a mixture of excitium and certain magnitudinum and possibly libidinum types, but mostly excitium. They are often either seductive at first, then become controlling, especially when in leadership roles or in relationships, and over time may start to have trust issues with the people they are engaged with, and a form of paranoia creeps in, and they may become accusing, aggressive, and increasingly controlling. Their currency is power and status, and they will compete with others for it, but often lack of moral fiber, and so will resort to deception, lying, and manipulation to get what they want. They often saw violence and had it acted out upon them, and now as adults will resort to physical, emotional, and mental violence against others when imposing control over them. The eyes are often magnetic and dazzling, as the eyes represent an orifice for energetic discharge, and this personality has an overcharge of energy in the upper body. They seduce, compel, threaten, and engage through their eyes, which always attract attention. They objectify and use their body to achieve their ends, just as they use others and any other resource to their own end without compassion or empathy. The rigid version of the psychopath, who lives more in their head, sounds like meritumic magnitudinum types. The masochist or endurer seems to correspond to our corpus. Since I've known a lot of corpus types, and it's a common type in Sweden, I can tell you that the causal mechanism described here is nonsense. They did not undergo ongoing intrusion, control, and humiliating subjugation at the hands of one or both parents till they gave up their free will and freedom. Of course, they're probably not only talking about corpus types, but the following sounds like corpus. The endurer has a mind and cognitive style that is slower, duller, and less imaginative or visionary than most. They normally lack spontaneity and can endure pain and suffering very well. They also have enormous strength and energy, will often be seen to have thick trunk and thick arms and legs, with thick, heavy muscular development. The mouth pulled into a permanent but false smile to show compliance. The eyes either are small and beady, showing the spite and resentment that lurks below the surface of the personality, and the muscles waiting to erupt, or they can be vacant and pleasing and show complete surrender and submission, and no longer show emotional effect beyond a type of pleasing innocence. They can take pain and appear dull to pain in the body. Their body does not move easily, but more as a total unit, a rigid, dense mass which has lost a lot of its flexibility. The rigid or obsessional seems to be a mixture of meritum and certain urbanum or libidinum types. It says, the rigid person essentially rejects their own nature, sexuality and humanity, and seeks instead to be an idealized version of themselves, one in which perfection is the only choice in all aspects and dimensions of life. Perfectionistic persons have pride as a key fault, and will have a deep conviction of being superior to others, which they may not publicly admit. They may still have a strong connection to the parent of the opposite sex, and may be daddy's little princess, or mommy's little man or her prince, having the original parent on a pedestal. In my experience, meriting women seems to have a close or special relationship with their mother, not necessarily the opposite sex. Daddy's little princess is more libidinum. Life to them is essentially a checklist of ongoing external challenges and accomplishments to be conquered, and the perfectionistic personality is very competitive within themselves and secretly with others. They must secretly try to win. It's a life or death struggle for many, a win-lose equation for most of them. Even when they win, their underlying anxiety gives them little time to stop and smell the roses and take in their achievements. They are already focusing on the next challenge and items to be ticked off in life. Nothing must challenge their thus far achieved status and level of perfection. They work out what society values as important in all areas of life, and then chases after that ideal. In a sense, due to their real inner low self-esteem, they compensate via what is termed outer or other esteem by achieving everything possible and having the most degrees and achievements, the best house, the right suburb to live in, the most connected friends, the right accessories that fashion trends dictate, the mandatory holiday, and being seen to socialize in the trendiest settings and with the right people. Once in power, they often demand perfection from others who do not understand this insane drive to achieve at the expense of happiness and life balance. The perfectionistic personality often resists entering therapy due to the notion that they must be perfect, and doing therapy or getting counseling is an admission of failure. Then they describe a hybrid between the schizoid and obsessive that sounds like a meritumic magnitudinum, a kind of fascistic type. Now, to develop a sensible and useful typology or model of personality, it must satisfy the following requirements. It must be connected with and follow timeless principles. It must include opposites and contradictions in the same individual. It cannot talk about pure types. Everyone must be a mixture of elements. It must be compatible and connected with sciences and real-world observations that we know are true. It should be able to explain the origin of types, which at the moment means acknowledging the problem with ordinary Darwinistic theory of evolution. It must admit the naturalness of types and refrain from pathologizing with the intent of merely curing or fixing types to adapt to society. It must exist in a context where types or personality traits are viewed from a perspective of purpose, not just categorization or labeling for the sake of fun. It should include and encompass all the traits we know of, good and bad, as well as explain the causal mechanisms behind them, a synthesis. It should be able to explain the observations of other typologies and replace their shortcomings. It must acknowledge creational causality and lack of free will in most contexts, that type is a kind of programming. It must include, take into account, both nature and upbringing, culture. And it must be supplemented with timeless man. Let's begin with timeless principles. Is this model now-centered? In its criticism of the obsessional type's striving, it does come close to this. It encourages people to be rather than do. The model gives some room for the reconciliation of opposites by recognizing that people can be a blend of energies. It does not explicitly talk about pure types. I guess I would be a mixture of schizoid, oral and psychopath, but with schizoid strongest. I identify the least with the masochist and the rigid. As I talked about in the beginning, I don't think it explains the origin of these types or energies well at all. It maybe explains extreme symptoms, but even then I don't think it's entirely correct. But while it does pathologize types to an extent, It does not try to make people conform to society, as far as I can tell. However, it does not really provide much to contemplate in regards to the purpose of types, besides a way to help them in therapy. Since I recognize most of the patterns I can think of in this synthesis, it's not that bad as far as typologies goes. But I do think the fiducian pattern is largely left out. Their explanation for the causal mechanism of the types, however, is a mess. It sort of acknowledges that people are wired with the energy since the womb, but in a poor context. It also claims that some energies develops earlier and others later. And some people, like Stephen Kessler, claims that the 5 patterns are not even types, but only coping mechanisms. However, I don't think that such clearly defined coping mechanisms and repetitive patterns can be separated from the idea of human types. It would just mean that they are blind to the reality of human types. Thus, by only focusing on defense mechanisms, many other fascinating aspects of character structures gets lost. It sides more with the side of nurture than nature, thus it does not present itself as a model of a natural man. In which case, how should we regard natural man free from childhood wounds? Some people, like Kessler, do supplement the patterns with an essence resembling timeless man, and so there is a program for development at the center of this typology. Unfortunately, this essence is mainly referred to merely as presence, which I find inadequate. So I would say that this system or concept reaches above level 4 in the evaluation compass. I think somewhere within the range of level 2 or 3 is where I would put it. Despite its flaws, I think the 5 personality patterns may be the best typology next to bias psychology. It's too bad that the descriptions have some problems, and fiducium and urbanum is somewhat missing. Despite that, I don't necessarily think that fewer categories must be a flaw. Sometimes it is more useful to make a broad approach with fewer specific categories to make it easier to use. A lot of typologies can be too complicated, and I'm struggling to keep a good balance in my own typology. But the weakness with fewer categories is that it will have less precision. It's clear that the 5 patterns were developed from a therapeutic perspective, but not a scientific or philosophical perspective. Yet there are hints of higher consciousness having taken some part in its development. But I think I have incorporated the most useful aspects of the 5 patterns into bias psychology already, which compels me to recommend that model over this one.